We're looking at a picture, not a poem, which might seem a little odd for a poetry podcast. It's of two men in a bed, naked from the waist up. One is a little more
And the
hirsute.
waist down, I think.
Well, yeah, and that one, one's a little bit hairier, more hirsute and mustachioed than the other. And their collective modesty, Pele, their collective modesty is covered by the bed sheets from the waist down. Um, it's an etching entitled "In the Dull Village." There's nothing dull about it, really, by none other than roll of drums. Do you want to reveal the name?
David Hockney.
David Hockney, way back in 1966. And it was one of a series of Hockney illustrations inspired by the poems of a Greek poet called Constantine P Cavafy. So tell me a bit about Constantine P Cavafy, because until you mentioned this episode, suggested this episode, Forbidden Love is what we're calling it, I wasn't familiar with this chap at all.
Right, so Constantine Cavafy, one of the great unsung heroes of poetry and gay poetry, now much more popular than he was 5 years ago, even. A very meek and modest Greek poet who would roam the streets of Alexandria and Athens with his notebook, writing poetry about young men. Now, the poetry is simplistic, modern, intimate, and quite the most readable poetry you could ever come across. How could this small, humble, mustachioed man from Alexandria suddenly have such appeal and panache? Well, we'll leave that to you to work out yourself because we're going to read one in a minute. But the reason that I discovered Cavafy was because when I was poet in residence at the Royal Academy, I was researching David Hockney's connection to poetry, and I discovered that the poet one thinks of, if one looks closely enough, when one thinks of David Hockney, apart from Walt Whitman, is Constantine Cavafy. Now, Hockney went to Beirut in the early 60s because he liked to walk in amongst the street scenes of Beirut and sketch these street scenes. Quote, the liberal cosmopolitan milieu appealed to the young artist, but it was the intimate poetry of Cavafy that appealed most of all to Hockney. And he decided that he was going to work on 20 plates and turn them into prints, born of his love of 14 of Cavafy's poems. Now, suddenly, these small little poems about Greek scenes in bedrooms, illicit love, and a slightly embarrassed twitch of the eye became the most radical, talked about prints in the British art scene in the 60s. Basically, literally, David Hockney had lifted Cavafy from obscurity and sent him into the parties and bedrooms of the grooviest people in England without Cavafy ever really knowing about it.
And the
Um,
story goes, it's a lovely story that
yeah,
Hockney discovered a collection of Cavafy's poems in Bradford Public Library of all places, and he decided not to borrow that copy, but to steal it to relieve it from its owners, the Corporation of Bradford. So his obsession, Hockney's early obsession with Cavafy, sort of brought Cavafy back to life because I think Cavafy had died 4 years, perhaps even before Hockney himself was born.
it's amazing because, many artists have been inspired by the great poets, but there's very few of those artists who have taken the poetry from their hearts and writ them large in their own work and used them to promote their own work. But in Hockney's case, also to exploit the genius of this little known man, and give him the attention that he deserved. I think that's the most admirable thing, that a great artist can lift a poet and make him famous
Little
again.
known and modest, not published in his own lifetime, perhaps because he knew the publishing industry would have taken a dim view, would have run 100 miles from much of the subject matter that he was as covering. So he was taken to sort of writing out and printing off copies of his poetry and sending it to local newspapers and circulating those poems among his friends. And I think there's a lesson there for those of us who would like our poetry to have a wider audience. You don't have to be published. You can just spread the word yourself in a modest way, and maybe some at some point during life, or ideally during life, but perhaps after death, suddenly you take off.
And it's also a bit like two friends in a bar, isn't it? You've got the one really confident one who is charismatic, everybody loves, and then you've got the quiet one who is sort of persuaded to go along. And then the next scene, the charismatic friend is nudging the other guy and saying, come on, go up to the mic, go and sing. And this guy has the best voice that anyone's ever heard. That's how you could interpret what Hockney did for Cavafy.
Yeah.
But there's one other thing, it's not that he turned the poems into these jazzy, trendy prints. Actually, Cavafy was giving Hockney something too. And the fact that Hockney chose to use these poems and make them into prints is important, because the delicate line of the pen is a reflection of the solitary nature of these poems in a way. And also the fact that they were prints is a way of Hockney replicating. It's like it becomes the everyman of the gay mentality. These prints are suddenly everywhere. These small, tiny rooms that Cavafy describes, the delicacy of them is suddenly everybody's. Brilliant.
Is there something about art more generally, and I include in that the etching by Hockney and the poetry, the lines of Cavafy, that is trying to explain what is ultimately inexplicable? Is love so difficult to properly understand that scratching on a piece of copper to make a print or writing words on a line in a notebook are just two quite similar, in a sense, ways of describing love, and in particular, thinking of the title of this episode, Forbidden Love?
Well, when as a poet, we both know when you want to get to the nub of the thing, you just write the truth of what's around you. It's so everyday. These two men in bed are a great metaphor for a poem. They're just lying in bed with sheet, as you so beautifully described at the beginning of the podcast, Rich. So the matter of factness of the print reflects the matter of factness of Cavafy's outpouring, really, which I think you're going to read now, aren't you? The poem that one of these prints describes, In the Boring Village.
In the boring village where he works, clerk in a textile shop, very young, and where he's waiting out the 2 or 3 months ahead, another 2 or 3 months until business falls off, so he can leave for the city and plunge headlong into its action, its entertainment. In the boring village where he's waiting out the time, he goes to bed tonight full of sexual longing, all his youth on fire with the body's passion, his lovely youth given over to a fine intensity. And in his sleep, pleasures come to him. In his sleep, he sees and has the figure, the flesh he longed for.
Beautiful.
It's electric. It's sparking, isn't it? Really, I can see why perhaps he would struggle to have got a publisher for that in 1910s Alexandria. So perhaps just circulating that among your mates was the safest thing to do. Wow, it's intense, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean the way that it's a story, isn't it? It starts once upon a time there was a guy who worked in a textile shop, and you think, why am I strangely gripped by this young man all of a sudden? And it's as if he's got you from the first line because something in the poem knows where it's taking you, and then suddenly there's his nighttime, his secret nighttime life.
And he was a clerk, wasn't he? For his secret nighttime life, he was a clerk, not in a textile shop, but he was a clerk in, I don't know, the public works department or something in Alexandria. I mean, he did that job for 30 years. So his love was stifled. It was forbidden. So perhaps in not being able to find an outlet to find an expression in a sexual way, the expression found its way out on paper onto the line, and you can hear the sparks coming off those lines. Not a traditional poem in the sense that it has any kind of rhyme structure, obvious rhyme structure to it. Even the line length varies, but very much a clear narrative born of his situation.
And the tension, like Cavafy knows what he's doing. He keeps repeating in the boring village, or it's in the title, then it comes right in the middle as well as on the first line. In the boring village, he goes to bed tonight full of sexual longing. It's like a kind of voiceover, isn't it, to a sort of porn movie or something, but it's parochial all at the same time.
Yeah. Well, as you're
And
saying that, I'm thinking of what it's like being underneath those high tension electricity pylon cables on a kind of slightly damp summer evening. You can hear the crackling as well as kind of feel it in your hair. It's like the moments before a thunderclap or a lightning strike.
exactly, and he's like, he can't say it in the world, so he's just going to say it right at straight out on the in the line. If I can't say it out there, I'm going to bloody well say it on this piece of paper.
Yeah.
And I think that's what illicit poetry teaches us. It reminds us, the forbidden poem, that we can be as secret and matter of fact as we want to simultaneously in one line.
Do you think there's a danger, however, because I have had a good look. I think I've had a good look at Cavafy's work since you suggested this as an episode, and there's a whole kind of subdivision of Cavafy that is to do with history and um, Greek history and ancient Greek history in particular. And I just wonder whether there's a danger that the historical stuff is not overshadowed by the homoerotic stuff. I think of something like Ithaca, which is a fantastic poem which reminds us that life is about the journey, not about the destination. I don't
One of
think
the
I've
greatest modern poems ever written. All listeners, please go and read Cavafy when we've finished gassing on.
Yeah, we'll put a link to Ithaca on the program website, pelecox.com, and also at richarduridge.com because it is well worth reading. And as I say, it would be a pity if we didn't widen our purview of Cavafy's work to the stuff that doesn't necessarily touch on the forbidden love theme. So we'll widen the focus now from Cavafy to who have you chosen next?
Yes, so I also like to talk about in terms of forbidden love and the way that poetry can cradle the cosmology of what's forbidden effect so effectively is Walt Whitman. I mean, Walt Whitman, as many of you know, was writing straight from his gut, Song of Myself, Leaves of Grass. It was so bodice ripping from an American gay male point of view, an existential point of view, a philosophical point of view. There was no way that he wouldn't have been able to write out his gayness at some point in his poetry. So I did a an event in Bradford with Simon Callow and Blake Morrison about David Hockney's love of Walt Whitman, who also featured in my performance about him. And David Hockney was sort of a great asset in the way that Hockney was a great asset to Cavafy. I think Whitman was a great asset to Hockney because of this unleashed feeling that the language of the self that Whitman gave to so many people, artists in particularly, and his fellow poets. So as Simon Callow was reading this one poem by Whitman out loud to the audience and to us in the um, in the panel, um, everyone sat there aghast, and he read it so beautifully that the tears even started rolling down his own cheeks. So I'm not going to be able to read it like Callow, but I hope you can just get a feeling for the intensity and the bravery of this poem by Whitman when I heard at the close of day. When I heard at the close of day how my name had been received with plaudits in the capital, still it was not a happy night for me that followed. And else, when I caroused or when my plans were accomplished, still I was not happy. But the day when I rose at dawn from the bed of perfect health, refreshed, singing, inhaling the ripe breath of autumn, when I saw the full moon in the west grow pale and disappear in the morning light, when I wandered alone over the beach and undressing, bathed, laughing with the cool waters and saw the sun rise, and when I thought how my dear friend, my lover, was on his way coming, oh, then I was happy. Oh, then each breath tasted sweeter, and all that day my food nourished me more, and the beautiful day passed well, and the next came with equal joy, and with the next at evening came my friend. And that night, while all was still, I heard the waters roll slowly, continually up the shores. I heard the hissing rustle of the liquid and sands, as directed to me, whispering to congratulate me, for the one I love most lay sleeping by me under the same cover in the cool night, in the stillness, in the autumn moonbeams. His face was inclined toward me, and his arm lay lightly around my breast, and that night I was happy. I'm silenced. I'm not swooning, I'm silenced.
Well, there could be a tear rolling down our collective cheeks, could there not? And no one's going to know any, there won't be any the wiser, given that this is a podcast rather than a video cast. But wow, the language there, I mean, so very, very visual that you kind of would expect from Whitman, but that comparison of the genuine, truly felt happiness of that moment with his lover compared to the material wealth and happiness of success and so on is quite extraordinary. You can hear the
There's a
poem, you
moment
can see the poem.
you can, and there's a moment when you read it out, you know, I don't know if this is the bit where Simon Callow hit the tank, but and when I thought how my dear friend, and when I wondered, and when I saw the full moon, and it's like it's an incantation. And after about the third of those, you start to feel that you're entering Walt Whitman's voice or his brain, because there's so much language, there becomes so much of the poet at the same time. It's magnificent. It's just such a beautiful love poem, I think.
You can see that poem, or you can see the landscape that it is written in. You can hear the poem, you can hear the water, the sand, you can see the moon dying as the daylight breaks. Um, and those are the poet's special powers, aren't they? The ability for us to see and not just hear a poem.
Absolutely. And there are three coincidences in this poetry, in this Cavafy, Hockney, and Whitman, that I'd like to share for me, which are that the man who was listening to one of the people listening to that Whitman poem in the audience when it was performed at the David Hockney event was a man called David Plant, who was head of creative writing at Columbia University. And I know him. I've known him since I was very young. And he came up to me at the end of the event and he said, the tears were rolling down my cheeks. See, every gay man cries when they hear this poem. Um,
And non-gay men cry as well.
if they like,
Okay,
if they can admit it.
just putting it out
But
there.
if they have, often the reason David Plant was crying, he told me, was because that when he was a young boy at his Jesuit boarding school, that Whitman poem was where he sought solace. After dinner on the doorstep in the cloister, he'd read that poem to himself because it was the only contact he could have with how he was feeling about his sexuality, and that Walt Whitman and that poem were his best friend. And there he was sitting in the Royal Academy all those decades later. And it must have been for him as if he was sitting there, that 15-year-old boy sitting there again. And I do just think poetry is a kind of time travel. If you've really bonded to a poem, it can take you straight back to where you were when you first read it. And the other coincidence is that his boyfriend or partner for a long time was the head of Thames and Hudson, a wonderful Greek inspirational man called Nikos Stangos. And Nikos Stangos was the man who translated Cavafy again, anew, and asked David Hockney to use his illustrations in the new translation of the book. So that's why you will see David Hockney's prints next to the poems, because of this great collaboration, this group of people who were very cultured and together doing these wonderful things for poetry and art.
So zooming out one notch further, um, you've chosen a Thomas Gunn, I've chosen a Carol Ann Duffy, both born of, if not forbidden love, love that couldn't be talked about um, overtly, so it can be written about covertly, it can be written about in code.
The traditional expectation is that poetry is in praise of something. So what do you do when that thing you want to praise is forbidden? For example, Wilfred Owen's Dulce and Decorum Est, in terms of war. Keats, branded for his Cockney poetry because he praised the view of Hampstead Heath rather than an outlook from his stately home. And Tom Gunn, when the AIDS crisis struck, was having to do something even more difficult, which was to write extremely erotic poetry as a gay man, but also describe the impact of the epidemic that these gay men were living through. And that resulted in his great, great, great collection, The Man with Night Sweats, which is another work of art that I recommend everybody read for its clarity. Also, Gunn was another great classicist and formalist. So I'd just like to read a poem from that, because to me it typifies everything we've spoken about today, and that how when he describes his friend falling against him, falling into him while he's walking down the steps because his liver's failing, that Tom Gunn manages to turn this into a mythical moment, and that it was only because of the realism of these homosexual poets who'd had to write roughly and sparely that they could suddenly understand the mythic in these simple moments. This is from a poem called Duncan, and this is this part 2. 40 years later, and both kidneys gone, every 8 hours, home dialysis, the habit of his restlessness stayed on, exhausting him with his responsiveness. After the circulations of one day, in which he taught a 3-hour seminar, then gave a reading clear across the bay, and while returning from it to the car with plunging, hovering tread, tired and unsteady, down the wheeler's steps, he faltered and he fell. Fell, he said later, as if I stood ready, into the strong arms of Tom Gunn. Well, well, the image comic as I might have known, and generous, but it turned things round to myth. He fell across the white steps there alone, though it was me indeed that he was with. I hadn't caught him, hadn't seen in time, and picked him up where he had softly dropped, a pillow full of feathers. Was it a rhyme he later sought, in which he might adopt the role of H.D., broken, hipped, and old, who, as she moved off from the reading stand, had stumbled on the platform, but was held and steadied by another poet's hand? He was now a posthumous poet, I have said, for since his illness he has not composed. in sight of a conclusion whose great dread was closure, his life soon to be enclosed, like the sparrow's flight above the feasting friends, briefly revealed where its breast caught their light, beneath the long roof between open ends, themselves the margins of unchanging night.
From dark to light, from hard to soft, from old and decrepit to young, and the playfulness amongst the misery, the posthumous poet who has not composed. I mean, just such clever use of language throughout, but that particularly drew my ear.
And that's what Keats, and every single, it's as if every single poet is in there. I'd like to say that I did mention HD last week, and she now appears in a poem by Tom Gunn. John Keats didn't write up when he got ill either. So Tom Gunn would have known that, and he's alluding to these things become tropes, become repeating myths through the history of poetry.
I was going to read Warming Her Pearls by Carol Ann Duffy, but I feel as if it would be doing Carol Ann Duffy a disservice to put her up next to your beautiful rendition of Tom Gunn. But perhaps we should save Warming Her Pearls for another
Mm,
episode, for fear of overstaying our welcome, but also for fear of, as I say, not wishing to undermine. Would you just read that, because it's so beautiful? Would you just read that bit again? Because I would like to hear it again. When you were talking about he's now a posthumous poet, not composed. I think he avoided the temptation to saying decomposed and composed. So it was very clever. Could you read from there to the end, and that will be the end note of this edition of Pele's Poetry podcast.
mhm. He was now a posthumous poet, I have said, for since his illness he had not composed, in sight of a conclusion whose great dread was closure, his life soon to be enclosed, like the sparrow's flight above the feasting friends, briefly revealed where its breast caught their light. Beneath the long roof, between open ends, themselves the margins of unchanging night.